Damascus. Well, we're going to get started straight away today with events in France because clearly some pretty terrible things are taking place, and there seems to be a lot more to it than just French people protesting. So Vanessa, let's bring you in straight away, and you're going to take us through your analysis of what's been happening in France.
And this is how I want to start. The image on the left of the Eiffel Tower, which appears to have flames kind of racing towards it, and the multiple hashtags that are appearing on Twitter in the last week or so. France has fallen, France on fire, very dramatic, sensationalist hashtags that are being deployed across Twitter. In fact, we're seeing sort of repetitive tweets being put out by what are clearly bot accounts with the same images. That image itself is AI, you might be interested to know, and there are many images that are appearing that are AI. What I first want to look at is a bit of analysis by Alex Craner. Alex Craner was recently at the Better Way conference in the UK. His reading of events: the government of French President Emmanuel Macron is under attack by the Anglo-American imperial establishment. Now, bear with me, Alex is not in any way defending Emmanuel Macron. He is not excusing Macron's puppeteering for the global elite, as he has done during his presidencies. But what he is saying, and I am sympathetic towards his overall message, if you just move on there, Brian. So these are the main points that Alex is making. I would recommend that everybody goes to his article and reads it because he goes into an awful lot more depth. So what he's saying: in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 terror attacks in the US, President George W. Bush announced to the world that you are either with us or you are against us. In 2003, there was French opposition to the US invasion of Iraq. In 2008, France opposition to Ukraine and Georgia joining NATO. It's worth noting also that Macron has a history of, let's say, friendship with oligarchs that are close to President Putin. There was the Benalla scandal, the security guard scandal, whom was receiving millions from Macron's government to provide security for Russian oligarchs that were inside France. So that's also worth noting. In 2019, Macron interview with The Economist, Emmanuel Macron warns Europe NATO is becoming brain dead. In 2022, Macron confirms that Russia has valid security concerns about NATO expansionism. And in April 2023, Macron visited China and discussed BRICS. A bit of it is actually missing off the slide, but there is actually also the AUKUS alliance, the alliance between the US, the UK, and Australia, that has effectively squeezed France out of military contracts. And one of the things that Alex mentions in his excellent analysis is the fact that he met with David Melvin, I think, at the Better Way conference, who has done serious analysis on the use of movies and TV series to pre-announce the plans of the globalist elite or the predator class. And this film, Athena, produced or published by Netflix, came out in 2022 and tells the story of ethnic civil war in France following the killing, the police killing of an Algerian youth. And funnily enough, fast forward to the 27th of June, 2023, and what we have? Apparent ethnic war in France following the killing of an Algerian youth. So I then started to go onto Twitter to see how people were actually reacting and where these reactions were coming from. So first of all, and this was just a random search on the hashtags France has fallen and France on fire. So I have Amy Meck here, apparently an investigative journalist. So let's have a look at her tweet. France has fallen leading. Police are unable to control the migrant and left-wing riots taking place across the country. That's interesting because prior to very recently, the protests against the Macron government and the globalist elite agenda in France has been led by right-wing, according to media reports, and government demonization and criminalization of those protests. So she goes on to say, Islamic attacks, riots, murders, rapes, assaults, and lynching of police across France are part of a new normal in a country struggling with mass illegal migration. And then she says, and I find this extraordinary, I wonder what Alex thinks of this comment, France is now the main Islamic country in Europe, with more than 10% of its population being Muslim. Well, one, France is not an Islamic country. It has a Muslim population, which is the highest in Europe. Let's just correct that phrasing. There is no coming back from this. Their future is Islamic. So I think we can get a clearer idea of where Amy Mack is taking this discussion. But let's see who she works for.
Sorry.
That's okay. So she works for the RARE movement, the Rise, Align, Ignite, and Reclaim movement in the United States. Just moving on, Brian, we can see what that is all about. So Rise, Align, Ignite, I've put that in red, Reclaim, grassroots activist organization leading a movement to reclaim our republic from the network of individuals waging war on Americans, our constitution, our borders, and our Judeo-Christian values. So that's pretty clear where this organization is putting its crosshairs, and let's have a look. There is confirmation of that. So they produce social media content which provides Americans a window into the deleterious effects of communism and Islamic supremacy on civilization. In addition, the principal individuals involved in RARE have been the driving force in numerous successful grassroots campaigns thwarting subversive infiltration efforts across the world. Does that sound familiar, Brian?
Well, it sounds familiar to me for an organisation that's been set up in order to control the public mindset. They all have a particular way of wording what they're doing, and then, of course, once you start to dig into who's behind it, you generally find maybe Mr. Soros, who I think will be giving a mention at some stage in the news.
Yes. And so let's have a quick look at how RARE is framing the riots in France. So first headline, Allahu Akbar, riots erupt in France after police shooting of 17-year-old Nahel with a lengthy criminal history. I'm not denying, actually, that Nahel does have a criminal history and that he did refuse to stop when he was asked to stop. But in my opinion, that doesn't validate shooting him. Islamic rioters hunt police in France, issue death threat. We are Muslims. We have the right to kill you. Incredible sensationalist hyperbole. And we also have to remember, France does have in its midst a number of the fanatics and extremists that it funded and sponsored in Syria and elsewhere in its imperialist campaigns to destabilize sovereign nations. So there is a possibility that there is a Gladio operation going on and that those elements are now being weaponized against the French people to instigate a civil war of sorts. Of course, who is being celebrated by RARE? Marine Le Pen calls for a return to Republican order amidst France's ongoing migrant and left-wing. So left-wing riots mentioned again. Moving on. So I want to just have a look at this video. This is a video in Lille of a car bomb going off. So these protests have suddenly escalated into quite extraordinary violence that we certainly haven't seen since 2019. And bearing in mind that the media until now had barely mentioned the yellow vest protests, the pension protests, the farmer protests, and so on. And here we have evidence of the fact that there are, we believe these are US manufactured weapons. I'm not a weapons expert, so I'm not going to confirm that, but reports are saying they are, and other reports are claiming that they've been brought in from NATO weapons supply to Ukraine, which would make a lot of sense if this is some kind of Gladio operation, because of course we're seeing NATO weapons being circulated from Ukraine into Syria, into Central African Republic, into Mali, etc. So there is a strong possibility of this. We also have Britain First wading in. This is Ashley Simon, the chairwoman of Britain First. Many of right-wing influencers in the UK were using this image of alleged barbarian hordes, I'm quoting the tweet, loot a Catholic bookstore in Nantes. Maybe they should read a book. It may help. France has fallen. We then have, moving on, Brian, you then also have Paul Golding, the leader of Britain First. Barbarian horde loots a Catholic bookshop in Nantes. France has fallen, as I say. You see very repetitive tweets from these right-wing influencers. And then I want to have a look at the actual looting of this bookshop, Brian, which is the video coming up. Now, have a look at the actual protagonists. Of course, they are all dressed in black. They are all masked. It's very difficult to tell who they are, but look at their hands. They are white. And I would argue that these are quite potentially agents provocateurs or even the right-wing militias that have been seen on the streets recently. But of course, the framing by the right-wing elements in the US and the UK in order to foment some kind of civil strife in France is that these are all migrant Islamists. Again, Jim Ferguson from the UK, who was a former Brexit Party member in Barnsley. As night falls across France, we see a nation in distress, a leader out of control and a people terrorized. Look at the hyperbole in these tweets. Censorship and a media internet blackout are about to begin. WEF orchestrated, interesting that he brings that in, and there is a high potential, as I've mentioned, that this is being orchestrated by the globalist elite to plunge France, which is perceived as a nation looking for its own identity and perhaps looking to uncouple itself from the US supremacist central power. Only a military intervention can bring this to an end. Well, also, where have we heard that before? And again, he's talking about France has fallen. Then we come on to what you mentioned, Brian. So this is a headline in the Express. Hated Macron, Paris riot humiliation, sees door open for Le Pen, exclusive poll. So in the Express article, we have the poll. Who do you blame for riots? Well, immediately migrants in first place with 41%. Macron in second place. It's also worth mentioning that during these riots, 5 Chinese tourists were hurt. Now, I'm not laughing because they were hurt, but I'm laughing at the extraordinary occurrence that if these Islamist migrants are battling against French racism and colonialism, etc., why would they attack 5 Chinese tourists? Unless, of course, this is an operation to create a rift also between China and the French government. So let's see who created this poll, the CEU Democracy Institute. And guess who's behind that, Brian? Moving on to the next slide. George Soros, a billionaire, philanthropist, and political activist, founded, this is taken from Wikipedia, so I haven't had to dig very far, founded Central European University in 1991 with an 880 million endowment, making it one of the wealthiest universities in Europe on a per-student basis. CEU's mission is to promote open societies and expand access to higher education, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera. So here we have the Soros hand on the events currently. And then let's have a look at what the Interior Minister, Gérald Darmanin, said about the actual people who were arrested. So he said 4,000 people were arrested. 90% of them were French. 10% were foreigners. Now, people are arguing with me on Twitter that, well, what does French mean? But they can't actually answer the question themselves. And I am getting severely attacked by right-wing white supremacist bots or 77th Brigade types on Twitter. This, I believe, Brian, is actually the UK column. I can't read it from here. It's retracting the claim that there was an internet clampdown by the government. Yes, is that correct?
Yeah, we got this wrong on Monday. We understand this document is not what it appears to be. Alex, very quickly, do you want to comment on this?
It looks like it has been graphically mounted. It's the proper Interior and Overseas Relations Ministry letterhead, but as often in these cases, it's suspiciously grainy around the letterhead, and it's purported to be a notification by the French Interior Ministry that people would have internet outages during the night. I didn't find proper sources for that. People have debunked it on the usual fake news and what do you call it, fact-seeking channels, which we don't want to give publicity to because we know what they're like. On this occasion, they were right with their great glee, but the vector is not all wrong, because Vanessa, who of course only uses reliable sources, has been putting out on her own Telegram channel that there has been discussion of social media posts being removed or edited to stop riots, but not an internet shutdown. That seems to be upping the ante, putting the needle up, beyond max in order to get a reaction.
Okay, yeah. Alex, thank you for that.
And just for some balance here, I'm going to bring in some tweets by people who are being a little bit more rational about what's going on. So this is Olivier Sauvage. It's worth retweeting. 90% of the 4,000 arrested were French. The French government was aware of the time bomb in 2017 and asked for a plan of action to save the youth in the suburbs. The project was done, but suddenly shelved to this day. WEF did not want more social spending, and he goes on also to point out that only stupid people like white supremacists ignore that without the immigrants, France will cease to function. No garbage collected, no workers doing the hard labor in construction, the thousands of Algerian doctors manning their hospitals, etc. And the tweet below mentions that France only wants immigrants when they're winning World Cup trophies for them. There is a big element of truth in that. And of course, also moving on, Gaddafi warned in March 2011 that the NATO destabilization project in Libya would lead precisely to millions of blacks who could come to the Mediterranean to cross to France and Italy. And Libya plays a role in the security in the Mediterranean. Well, this is now coming home to roost. And we also have to remember, of course, France's colonial past. In 1961, it's worth people checking out the worst massacre in French history since the Second World War, which was the massacre of Algerian refugees in Paris and the dumping of their bodies in the Seine. Official figures say less than 100 killed. Unofficial figures are as high as 600. So that was back in 1961, a part of France's colonial history that it doesn't want to talk about, and that none of these Twitter influencers are, of course, bringing in as context. And recently, of course, back in mid-June, at least 78 dead. People are saying, again, way more than that, perhaps up to 600, after the fishing boat loaded with refugees and migrants sinks off the Greek coast. And just finally, what I wanted to point out to people, remember in 2016, when NATO member states wanted a no-fly zone over Aleppo while the Syrian Arab Army was in the process of liberating eastern Aleppo from Western-backed terrorists, we saw ubiquitous Aleppo is burning hashtags produced by US State Department-linked PR firms. And I think that that is very much what we're seeing now. It's a very complex situation, but I think be aware of people generating sensationalism and hyperbole and effectively whipping up hate against a sector of the French population.
Okay, Vanessa, thank you very much for that. There's a lot to discuss around the whole of these events in France. We can do a little bit more in UK Column Extra after the news today. But one little point is that there's several people in our chat box have pointed out that the men breaking the glass window, it was clear that some of them at least were wearing white gloves, but whether there were other hands that were visible, I couldn't see. But what we're encouraging our viewers to do, of course, is check everything we're talking about and make your own opinion up. But also, if you see things that you believe are important for us, then do let us know. But we'll talk more about this in extra time.